Okay, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, April 15th. On Monday, we started to go over game theory, but since my life is currently one continuous, absurd apology for technical difficulties, we're going to go over that introduction just briefly again today. We're talking about game theory here, and this is important and ties into our discussion of the spectrum of competition. And this connection will be made clear throughout the next few lectures. But we're talking about the interaction between individuals involved in some situation in which their decisions affect the utility of others. We call this a game. Oligopolists are involved in a game when they decide to compete with one another, collude, work together to form essentially a monopoly. They can undercut each other's prices. When they compete, they will match price cuts but not price increases in order to get more of the market for themselves. And so we're going to talk about the thought process that an oligopolist has that leads to acting as a competitive firm or colluding with other oligopolists in the industry. And to talk about that, we're going to do a detour into the world of game theory. Okay, we talked on Monday, there's two types of games, two ways to lay out games. The first is the normal form game, this one on top, this box form. And we're going to talk about that on Friday because that one is a little more complicated to solve. And it's a little more complicated because the players in this game move at the same time. So when you see a box like this, think of a game like rock, paper, scissors, where I tell you the rules, I explain rock, paper, scissors, and then you and your friend, 1, 2, 3, shoot. You both put out either rock, paper, or scissors at the exact same time. Important to know for game theory, essentially all players in the game, all participants in the scenario that we're setting up are able to, essentially they can see the game as we've written it out. What that means is players understand the possible moves that they can make, the possible moves that another player can make, and the payoffs that they will both get from both of those moves, okay? The difference between a normal form game and this extensive form game, which we have below in this game tree format, the difference between these is that in this extensive form game, we have players moving one at a time. And you can sort of see that visually in this example I've written out here. If we start from the left, we read left to right. I'm the first mover here. And let's go through and interpret this game tree. So, hold on a second. All right, so let's interpret this game tree here. Read from left to right. At this first node, a node is what we call these blue dots. We have the player's name above the node. So this is my decision. I get to go first, and I have two options. I can go bowling, or I can stay home and watch Tiger King. Okay? If I decide to go bowling, then we're going to move along this line to another node where it's now your turn. And then you have decisions to make from there. So we have this sequential move game, this extensive form game. It's in the form of a game tree. These are all vocabulary terms that you can use or hear when we're referring to this type of game, where we move one at a time. Okay, so if I decide to go bowling, it is then your turn, and then you have some options. But if I decide instead to stay home and watch Tiger King, we have reached an end point of the game. How do we interpret these numbers, 8 and 0? Well, I'm the first mover. My name is above this first node. So my utility is going to be this first number. This number 8 is my utility. Hold on, Karen just got her ball in the trash. Okay, all right, that's my fault. I threw it over there. I'm sorry. All right. So this first number at each of these endpoints is going to be my utility because I'm the first mover. And it's just that simple. So I'll write a little E under this 8 to show that that's my payoff. And then this 0 would be your payoff if we ended at this node. Okay? And when I say payoff, I mean utility, right? I get a happiness quotient of 8 or whatever it may be. My happiness is worth 8. However you've been explaining utility to yourself in your head throughout the semester, I get 8 of those, 8 happiness points. Okay, so if I stay home and watch Tiger King, I get 8 happiness, 8 utility, and you get 0 utility, 0 happiness from me staying home and watching Tiger King. And one important thing to note about game theory is that, and economics in general, this is one of the main tenets of economics we've been talking about, is that utility is a given. We don't question it. Utility is given. We don't question it. It is just the fact of the world that I get 8 happiness from staying home and watching Tiger King. And that if I stay home and watch Tiger King, you get 0 happiness. Okay, so what if I decide to go bowling? Well, now it's your turn. You're player 2. Player 1 is just the player who goes first. Player 2, player who goes second. Okay, now it's your turn. I've decided to go bowling, and in this scenario, if I decide to go bowling, then you have the choice to either go bowling or to stay home and do economics. If you decide to go bowling, well, then I will get a utility of 1. Don't forget that that first number is always going to be my payoff because I was the first mover. Okay, so if you go bowling and I also go bowling, I get a utility of 1 and you get happiness of 5. Okay? If I go bowling, but you decide to stay home and do economics, I get utility of 7 because I get to go bowling and I don't have to see your weird dumb face at the bowling alley. And you get a utility of 10 because you get to stay home and do economics. Okay, so how do we solve this game? How do we decide, given these moves and given the payoffs that we have for every move, how do we decide where this game is going to end up? Change my pen color here. Okay. We solve a game like this using something called backwards induction. We're going to move backwards in order to solve it. So we're actually going to start with player 2's decision. That's you. So let's assume that I have already decided I'm going to go bowling. You know that I've decided to go bowling. So your options are now to go bowling or to stay home and do economics. Which of these two are you going to decide to do? Well, you're going to decide to stay home and do economics because you get utility of 10 from that action. And you only get utility of 5 from going bowling. 10 is greater than 5. You're always going to want that higher utility. So if I decide to go bowling, you will stay home and do economics, meaning if I decide to go bowling, you will not go bowling. So this part of the game is dead. We're never going to end up here because if we make it to this point where I've chosen to go bowling, you are going to choose to stay home and do economics every single time because you get more utility from that. Okay. So now I know that if I choose to go bowling, you will choose to stay home and do economics. So now I have a decision to make. I can go bowling, in which case you will immediately stay home and do economics, giving me a utility of 7, or I can just stay home and watch Tiger King and get a utility of 8. So what am I going to do? I'm going to stay home and watch Tiger King, meaning I will not choose to go bowling, so this part of the game is dead. And if we were to run this game in reality, you would actually never get to make a decision because I right away would decide to just stay home and watch Tiger King. So using this backwards induction, we get to this end point. And I'm going to be a little fast and loose with the vocabulary you're learning here because we're just doing a little fun detour. If you pursue game theory any further, you will learn the more technical ways to use this term. But a potential endpoint for a game is called a Nash equilibrium. So this is our Nash equilibrium, named after John Nash, father of game theory, featured in the book A Beautiful Mind by Sylvia Nasar, and later on a movie that I have never seen. Okay. So Nash equilibrium is the endpoint of the game that you will find. So when I ask for the Nash equilibrium, which I do on your homework, I'm asking you to, if it's a game tree like this, to do the backwards induction and tell me where we're going to end up. Okay. Okay, and as I said, today we're focusing on extensive form games mostly. We'll get into normal form games a little bit as well, but those are a little bit more complex. Okay, let's move on and let's do another example. So why do we do this backwards induction movement? Well, because in reality, you take the second player's moves into account when you decide to make a move first. An example I like to use for this is, do you ask your crush to prom if you know they're going to say no? Probably not. You probably don't ask. You have unintentionally done game theory in your brain by making this decision. You have already taken the second player's move into account before you make your first move. So let's look into this and let's do some backwards induction. Okay, so here's what we're doing. You are player 1. Your crush is player 2. Okay. You have two options. You can do nothing. You can just not play. In that case, you get utility of 0. You are the first mover, so the first number in these pairs is your payoff, and your crush also gets a utility of 0. Okay. All right, so you choose to do nothing, you both get 0, or you can choose to ask your crush to prom, in which case they will either say yes, and you both get utility of 8, or they will say no, and you here get a utility of -1 because you're so embarrassed and dejected, and they get utility of 9 for whatever reason. Utility is a given, so we can just speculate about why we get those payoffs. I like to think that it's because your crush then feels good about themselves, but they don't have to go to prom. It's the best of both worlds. All right, anyway. Okay, so backwards induction here. Let's assume that you have asked your crush to prom. Does the crush say yes and get a utility of 8, or does the crush say no and get a utility of 9? Well, 9 is greater than 8, so if the crush is asked to prom, they're going to say no. This part of the game is dead. You're never going to end up there. Cross that off. Okay, so now back to you. You know that if you ask the crush to prom, the crush will say no, and you will get a utility of -1. You also know if you do nothing, you get utility of 0. Well, 0 is greater than -1, so you will not ask your crush to prom. You will do nothing. This is the Nash equilibrium of the game. Let's have a look. Nash equilibrium. Okay. Anyone have any questions? Just kidding. This isn't a live recording. All right, we're going to do a bunch more examples, mostly because they're fun, but also because the more examples you do of these, the better you'll feel about yourself, about game theory, about economics, and the better I will feel knowing that you know these things now. Oh, this is the one we just did, staying home and watching Tiger King or going bowling. I will delete that slide, actually. Okay. Here's a basic one that you'll find in all of your beginning game theory textbooks. Here we've only named the players player 1 and player 2 for simplicity, and each player has an option to choose the path going up or the path going down. We've got our payoffs here. Okay, let's jump right into it. So assume that it is player two's turn. Assume that player one has chosen up, and now player two gets to go. If player two picks up, player two gets a payoff of 0 utility. If player two picks down, player two gets a payoff of 1 utility. Okay, 1 is greater than 0. If it comes to the point where player two gets to take a turn, we're never going to choose this arm of the game. This arm is dead. We're always going to go down. Okay, player one's turn. If player one goes directly down, player one will get a payoff of only 2. If player one decides to go up, then player two will go down, and player one will get a payoff of 3. 3 is greater than 2, so in this instance, the Nash equilibrium is here. Player one will choose to go up, and player two will choose to go down. According to the payoffs here, we can absolutely trust that player two is always going to pick down if it comes to it. If it's player two's turn, they will always choose to go down. Because the utility is set, we always prefer greater utility. 1 is greater than 0. I can't be clearer about this. Okay, here's one that has to do with the oligopoly situation we've been talking about. We have 2 firms in the industry of ride sharing. We have Lyft and we have Uber. Now remember that there are multiple ways in which oligopolists can interact with one another, right? They can collude, meaning they can work together. And when oligopolists work together, when they collude, they are working together to keep prices high and output low, which is the same thing a monopolist tries to do, right? We want to make money. We don't want to work that hard. It makes perfect sense. We want our price to be high. We want our output to be low. So if you are efficiently working together, these 2 ride-sharing companies will essentially form a monopoly of ride-sharing. Okay, so oligopolists can collude or they can compete. And when they compete, they act more like perfect competitors or monopolistic competitors, something more to the left of our spectrum of competition. Okay, if they choose to compete, then we're going to see such behavior as matching price cuts, right? If Uber cuts their prices, then Lyft also will. Matching price cuts. You won't match a price increase, because if Uber increases prices, Lyft can just leave its prices right where it is, because Uber has just automatically made itself more expensive than Lyft, so Lyft is just going to chill out and enjoy the increased business. So we're going to compete by matching price cuts, but not price increases, and we can also compete by increasing output, right? Lyft could hire more drivers. It could make it so whenever you open the Lyft app, you see that you are flooded with possible lifts you can take. You're surrounded by possible lifts. So you're more likely to buy from Lyft. Lyft has a greater market share. They are consuming a greater piece of the available pie of profit. Okay. All right. So here we go. Here's how we would lay these oligopolist decisions out in order. First of all, Lyft can go first, and Lyft can choose to collude, or Lyft can choose to go into a price war, meaning we're competing, right? We're undercutting Uber's prices. If we go into a price war, Lyft is going to get a payoff of 4, and Uber is going to get a payoff of 3. Okay. If Lyft decides to collude with Uber and work together, well, Uber can decide to accept this offer of collusion or to compete. If Lyft chooses to collude, then it's Uber's turn. Lyft has come to Uber with this offer this opportunity to collude. And if Uber agrees and they collude, they're both going to get a payoff of 5. But if Uber does not agree and says, no, I'm going to continue competing, then we have Lyft here getting a payoff of 3 and Uber getting a payoff of 4. Again, Lyft is the first mover, player 1, Uber's player 2, therefore the first number is always Lyft's payoff, and the second number is always Uber's payoff. Okay, so let's do some backwards induction here. Change the pen color. I'll make it lava colored. Check this out. Hold on. Yeah, nice. Okay, backwards induction. If we make it to the point where it's Uber's turn, Lyft has come to Uber with the offer to collude. Uber can agree, choose to collude, get utility of 5, or enter into a price war, get utility of 4. Well, 5 is greater than 4, so if it comes down to it and it's Uber's turn, we are never going to see this part of the game. Uber's never going to go down that path. We'll go straight to collusion. Okay. So now Lyft is aware of this. Lyft knows that if it comes to Uber with the opportunity to collude, Uber will agree, and Lyft will get this payoff of 5. Or Lyft could compete with Uber, go into a price war, and get a payoff of 4. So in its brain, Lyft is comparing these payoffs. Colluding gives us 5, price war gives us 4. So Lyft is never going to go down this price war path. They're going to collude. Uber's going to agree. Everybody's going to get a payoff of 5. This is our Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium. I've drawn over this. Okay, I've drawn over these, but these payoffs were 4 and 3. And this payoff was 3 and 4. And this payoff is 5 and 5. So here we've reached another vocabulary term that I'm not going to stress too much because it is a bit complicated, but I do want you to be aware of it. This Nash equilibrium is also what we call Pareto optimal. Pareto, another game theory guy. Pareto optimal. Okay, the definition of Pareto optimality, you're just going to have to memorize it. And you're just going to have to be able to spit it back out. A Nash equilibrium is Pareto optimal if, write that down, okay, a Nash equilibrium is Pareto optimal if neither player can be made better off, so neither player can improve her utility. Neither player can be made better off without making the other player worse off. Get into that a little bit. Okay, what does this mean? Well, we both have utilities of 5 here. In this case, this is the highest utility that either player can get, right? So in fact, going to any other node will make both players worse off. Nash equilibrium is Pareto optimal if neither player can be made better off without making the other worse off. So let's look at this first payoff here. Let's assume that Lyft just decides to go straight into a price war, even though they never would. That's not rational. Anyway, Lyft decides to do a price war. Lyft gets payoff of 4. Uber gets payoff of 3. And we say, well, wait a minute. We can make Uber better off over here because Uber gets a payoff of 4. But we've done this at the expense of Lyft, who now loses a point of utility. Okay. I want you to write this down. I just want you to memorize it, have it in your brain, think about it. A Nash equilibrium is Pareto optimal if neither player can be made better off without making the other worse off. And we're going to see, as we continue on into normal form games and the prisoner's dilemma and oligopoly theory, that we have situations where Nash equilibria are not Pareto optimal. And that's where economics really becomes important. These situations where we find individuals working in their own self-interest will actually hurt their payoffs in the end. And we will see that oligopolists will end up doing that. Let's do another example here. This is a classic from old game theory books back when we cared about the USSR. 2 players, player 1, USA, and player, okay. Ooh, hold on, let's see what else we got here. Come on, I gotta go with the galaxy. Okay, player 1, USA, player 2, USSR, boo, USSR. I don't have any strong feelings about the USSR. Okay, so USA has 2 options. It can just don't, it can just not, it just can't, it just won't even, and everyone gets payoff of 0. Or instead of just don't or just not, the USA can attack the USSR. These are the 2 options the USA has. This is obviously a false dichotomy. So USA decides to attack the USSR. USSR can retaliate, or the USSR can just do nothing. Backwards induction, we're going to assume that the USA has decided to attack. It's now the USSR's move. USSR can retaliate, get a payoff of -4, or do nothing and get a payoff of -2. Which of these is the USSR going to do? If it's its turn, it's going to do nothing. So this part of the game is dead. We will never end up there. We will never end up here. I like to think about backwards induction kind of like when you have really great imaginary arguments in the shower, right? If someone says this, you're going to come back with this amazing comeback, or you're going to do this or that or whatever. So USSR is kind of like sitting here planning what it's going to do when it's its turn. And the USA knows that USSR is sitting there planning what it's going to do when it's its turn. You know, okay. I could get way deeper into those examples, but I will not. Okay. So USA attacks USSR, and they know that the USSR will not retaliate, meaning that if USA attacks, USA is guaranteed a payoff of 1. If USA does nothing, we're getting this payoff of 0. So USA's turn, they're going to choose to attack. USSR will not respond. This is our Nash equilibrium. 1 and -2 is where we are at right now. Nash equilibrium, right there. Okay. One more longer example here. A little bit more complex. Perhaps you have been wondering if this can occur. The answer is yes. These games can get as complicated as you wish. Okay, so here we have Boris and Patricia. See, we have 3 decision nodes involved, but only 2 deciders still. Okay. Boris goes first, so we call him player 1. Patricia goes second, so we call her player 2. Oh, but now it's Boris's turn again, but have no fear. Boris is still technically player 1. We're still calling him player 1. At every point here, Boris's payoffs are still the first. Okay? Boris, and then Patricia is always going to get these second ones, okay? So even though Boris gets to take another turn after Patricia, the first payoffs are always going to refer to him. Okay, so Boris can decide to have a beer. If he does that, Patricia can decide to have a beer. If Patricia has a beer, Boris can decide to have a second beer. I don't like using alcohol in my examples, but that's what we're doing. Okay, so we're going to do backwards induction here. Let's assume that Patricia has decided to have 1 beer, then Boris can either do nothing, in which case he'll get a payoff of 2, or Boris can decide to have a second beer, in which case he will get a payoff of 3. 3 is greater than 2, and Boris knows it. He's a smart guy. So this part of the game is dead. We're never going to end up there. Okay. Now we back one node up to Patricia. Patricia can have 1 beer, in which case she will get slooped right down to this payoff of 1. Or she can decide to do nothing, to not have a beer, and she'll end up with a payoff of 0. Patricia, just like Boris, is a smart player. She knows 1 is greater than 0. So this part of the game is dead. She's never going to end up there. If it comes to the point where Boris has had 1 beer and now it's Patricia's turn, she will also choose to have 1 beer, in which case Boris will have a 2nd beer, and we will end up here. So now that we're at this first node where it's Boris's turn again, Boris really only has 2 things to choose between, 1 decision to make. He can choose to do nothing, in which case he gets a payoff of 0, and so does Patricia, but Boris doesn't care about Patricia's payoff. Or he can have 1 beer, which will fast track him all the way here to these payoffs where he gets 3. Boris knows 3 is greater than 0. This part of the game is dead. He's never going to go down there. This is our Nash equilibrium. Boris gets a payoff of 3. Patricia gets a payoff of 1. At this point, Boris has had 2 beers, and Patricia has only had 1. Okay, that is extensive form games. On Friday, we will go over normal form games. You should be able to answer at least 1 question on your homework now that you were not able to answer before. Okay, email me with any questions. Thank you very much. Goodbye.